Honestly, I am just so tired of people thinking they own the universe. Like, literally exhausted by the sheer audacity of someone holding a suspiciously empty jug of industrial algae destroyer over a brick wall and pretending nothing happened. Anyway, let's see how this plays out.
The morning air in Westlake Hills already felt like breathing through a hot, wet towel, and it wasn't even 7 o'clock yet. I stood on my back patio, the rough stone cool against my bare feet, the belt of my terrycloth bathrobe hanging loosely at my sides. In my right hand, my favorite oversized mug held the only thing keeping me tethered to polite society, a double shot of espresso, black as oil. I took a sip, closed my eyes, and listened for the familiar, soothing sound of water cascading over the imported river rocks of my custom-built backyard oasis. I didn't hear a cascade. I heard a thick, wet, synthetic glug, glug, glug. My eyes snapped open. The mug nearly slipped from my fingers, splashing scalding coffee onto my knuckles, but I didn't even feel the burn. My pond, my $10,000 painstakingly balanced, wound chemically perfected, triple-filtered Japanese koi pond was glowing. Not a natural algae bloom kind of green. No, this was the radioactive neon emerald green of a comic book villain's toxic waste vat. Thick, soapy foam crested at the edges of the limestone borders, bubbling up and popping with a sinister little fizzing sound. The air smelled sharply of chlorine, ammonia, and something intensely chemical that immediately made the back of my throat itch. My heart dropped into my stomach like a lead weight. No, 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 I muttered, sprinting across the perfectly manicured Bermuda grass, completely ignoring the morning dew soaking the hem of my robe. I reached the edge of the limestone coping and fell to my knees. The water, usually crystal clear all the way down to the black rubber liner, was opaque, and there, bobbing near the skimmer box, was a flash of metallic orange and white. Bert. He was floating completely upside down, his delicate, fan-like fins stiff and motionless. A foot away, half obscured by the noxious green froth, was Ernie. Two magnificent 3-year-old Showa koi that I had hand-selected from a breeder in California, fish that I had practically hand-fed every single morning. Dead. Murdered in their own home. I felt a very cold, very dark kind of anger start to pool in my chest. This wasn't an accident. Ponds don't spontaneously turn into chemical weapons facilities overnight. Oh, what a shame. Looks like you've got a little algae problem there. Neighbor. The voice was nasal, dripping with a sickeningly sweet condescension that made my molars grind together. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was, but I did. While standing on her tiptoes, peering over the 6-foot brick wall that separated my property from hers, was Brenda. Brenda, the 50-something terror of the cul-de-sac. Brenda, who wore a sharply angled bob haircut that looked less like a style and more like a warning label. She had a pair of oversized designer sunglasses perched on her head and was wearing a bright pink tennis outfit that was entirely too energetic for this hour. But what really caught my eye, what made that cold anger in my chest suddenly spark into a blazing inferno, was what she was holding in her left hand. It was resting casually on the top of the brick wall, a large, white, industrial-sized plastic jug. The label was partially turned away, but I could clearly make out the bright red hazard warnings and the words algae destroyer, commercial grade, and the jug looked suspiciously empty. I stood up slowly, wiping my wet hands on my bathrobe. I forced my face into a mask of total chilling calm, the kind of calm that precedes a Category 5 hurricane. Brenda, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. What did you do? She let out a high-pitched, entirely fake little laugh. Me? I didn't do anything. I'm just out here enjoying my morning. I couldn't help but notice your little water feature looks a bit swampy today. I always told you that noise was a nuisance. Stagnant water attracts mosquitoes, you know. It's a health hazard for the whole neighborhood. My water isn't stagnant, Brenda. Or at least, it wasn't until you dumped a gallon of industrial bleach into a delicate aquatic ecosystem. I took a step closer to the wall. You killed my fish. You poisoned my property. She gasped, unclutching her chest in a theatrical display of mock outrage. I have no idea what you're talking about. How dare you accuse me of such a thing? I was merely carrying out some recycling. She subtly shifted the jug, trying to pull it down behind the wall. Recycling? I barked a laugh, the sound harsh and sharp in the quiet morning air. You're recycling a commercial-grade algaecide over the shared property line? Do you think I'm an idiot? I know you've been complaining to the HOA about the sound of my waterfall for 6 months. I know you threatened to take care of it at the last board meeting. Brenda's fake smile vanished, replaced by a smug, tight-lipped sneer. The mask was off. You have absolutely no proof of anything. It's your word against mine. And honestly, the neighborhood is better off without that constant, that annoying trickling sound. Maybe now you can fill that ugly hole in with some nice dirt. Have a blessed day. She turned on her heel and disappeared behind the wall. I heard the sharp clack, clack, clack of her tennis shoes retreating toward her back door, followed by the heavy thud of it slamming shut. I stood there for a long time, staring at the neon green foam. I looked at Bert and Ernie. My fists were clenched so tight my fingernails were cutting into my palms. She thought she had won. She thought because there wasn't a camera pointed directly at that specific 3-foot section of the wall, she could just destroy my property and walk away with a smug little wave. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just turned around, walked back into my house, just set my coffee mug on the granite kitchen island, and picked up my phone. 20 minutes later, the distinct, heavy rumble of a Ford Explorer police cruiser pulled into my driveway. I was still in my bathrobe. Changing clothes felt like conceding a point I wasn't ready to concede, waiting by the front door. Officer Miller lumbered up the walkway. He was a veteran cop, the kind who looked like he had seen everything twice, and was thoroughly exhausted by all of it. Sweat was already pooling in the creases of his uniform shirt. He took off his sunglasses and sighed heavily as I led him through the house and out to the back patio. Mother of pearl, Miller muttered, stopping at the edge of the pond. He pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket, though he didn't uncap his pen. Smells like a municipal swimming pool that got hit by a chemical truck. What happened here? I pointed a shaking finger toward the brick wall. My neighbor, Brenda. She dumped a jug of industrial algaecide over the wall, killed my koi, destroyed a $10,000 setup because she doesn't like the sound of the waterfall. Miller rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes scanning the scene. Okay. Did you see her pour it? I saw her standing right there at the wall with an empty jug of the stuff, I explained, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. She admitted she hated the pond. She threatened me at the HOA meeting. It's obvious what happened. Miller sighed again, a deep, rumbling sound of pure bureaucratic fatigue. Look, son, I understand you're upset. Those are some expensive-looking fish. But obvious doesn't hold up in a courtroom. If you didn't see the liquid leave the jug and enter the water and you don't have it on camera, I can't do much. You can't do much? I repeated, my voice rising an octave. It's vandalism. It's destruction of property. Go over there and look at the jug. Smell her hands. I can't go forcefully smelling a woman's hands without probable cause, and standing near a wall with a plastic bottle isn't probable cause for a search warrant, Miller said, his tone shifting from sympathetic to strictly professional. He finally clicked his pen and jotted something down. It's a civil matter. You can file a report for the property damage, take her to small claims court. But as for criminal charges, my hands are tied. Get some security cameras, point them at the wall. If she does it again, and then we have a conversation. Sorry about your fish. He handed me a small white card with a case number scribbled on it. A piece of paper. That was the extent of the law's protection today. I watched him trudge back through my house, the heavy front door clicking shut behind him. I was alone again, with the neon green water. A civil matter. Small claims court. I scoffed out loud. Suing Brenda would take months, maybe years. It would cost thousands in lawyer fees, and even if I won, what would I get? The replacement cost of 2 fish and a water pump? She would write the check, roll her eyes, and feel absolutely zero remorse. She would still sit on her patio, drinking her mimosas, smug in the knowledge that she had successfully bullied me into submission. No. Small claims court was for amateurs. And small claims court was for people who didn't know how to weaponize the system. I needed something bigger. Something undeniable. Something that Officer Miller couldn't just brush off with a heavy sigh and a notebook. I needed something federal. I retreated to my garage. This was my sanctuary, a chaotic but organized space filled with power tools, old server racks, and a workbench covered in half-finished projects. I dragged a metal stool over to my secondary workstation, booted up my laptop, and cracked my knuckles. I started digging. I spent 4 hours tumbling down a rabbit hole of property law, municipal codes, and environmental regulations. I looked up Austin zoning ordinances. I read through the Texas Water Code. I even skimmed the Federal Communications Commission guidelines on satellite dish placements. Just in case I could build a giant, ugly radio tower right on the property line purely out of spite. But spite wasn't enough. I needed a trap. I needed Brenda to do exactly what she just did. But this time, I needed the consequences to be apocalyptic. And then, somewhere around page 42 of a deeply boring PDF from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, I found it. The golden ticket. The silver bullet. My eyes widened as I read the text on the screen. I leaned closer, my heart starting to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And the Endangered Species Act of 1973, 16 U.S.C. Section 1538. I quickly opened a new tab and searched for Endangered Species, Austin, Texas Aquatic. The search results populated instantly, dominated by one very specific, very weird-looking creature. The Eurysea tonkawai. The Jollyville Plateau salamander. It was a small, pale, almost translucent amphibian that lived entirely underwater in the springs and aquifers around Austin. It looked a bit like a discarded gummy worm that had sprouted tiny, fragile legs and frilly external gills. And most importantly, it was critically endangered. It was fiercely protected by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. I kept reading, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Because the salamander's natural habitat was constantly threatened by urban development, local universities and the USFWS had established safe harbor agreements. This meant that private property owners could volunteer their land or their water features to serve as protected foster habitats for the species, provided the water quality met extremely strict, federally mandated standards. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. a slow, wicked grin spreading across my face. If Brenda poisons a standard backyard koi pond, she gets a stern talking to and maybe a civil lawsuit for property damage. But if Brenda knowingly, or even unknowingly, dumps a toxic chemical into a federally recognized, safe harbor designated critical habitat containing an endangered species, that wasn't a misdemeanor. That wasn't a civil matter. Under the Endangered Species Act, causing harm to or altering the habitat of a listed species is legally defined as a take. And an illegal take of an endangered species is a federal crime. It carries penalties of up to $50,000 in fines per violation, and up to a year in federal prison. I looked back at the screen, and the University Conservation Program was actively looking for local residents with existing water features to participate in the breeding and fostering program. They needed enclosed, predator-free zones with clean, flowing water. They needed exactly what I had, or rather, what I was about to build. The game had just changed. Brenda didn't know it yet, but she hadn't just picked a fight with her neighbor. She was about to pick a fight with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a dozen highly trained, heavily armed federal agents who take their gummy worm salamanders very, very seriously. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang 3 times before a gruff, sandpaper voice answered. "Yeah?" "Tommy," I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. It's me. I need you to bring the crew to Westlake Hills. We're ripping out a koi pond." There was a long pause on the line. "I built that pond, kid. It's a masterpiece. Why are we ripping it out?" "We aren't ripping it out to destroy it, Tommy," I said, my grin widening until my cheeks hurt. "We are upgrading it. We are building a fortress, a highly classified, federally protected, chemical-proof fortress. And I need it done by the end of the week." "Sounds expensive," Tommy mumbled. "It's going to be," I replied. "But the look on my neighbor's face when the feds show up in tactical gear? That is going to be absolutely priceless." 2-ton Tommy arrived the next morning at exactly 6 a.m., and honestly, subtlety was never his strong suit. His beat-up, diesel-guzzling Ford F-35. O'Duali sounded like a dying tractor as it rattled down the pristine, aggressively quiet streets of Westlake Hills. He parked half on my driveway and half on the perfectly manicured grass, the air brakes hissing like an angry dragon. Tommy is like a mountain of a human being. He's ex-con, heavily tattooed, and speaks in a gravelly mumble that makes you feel like you owe him money. He climbed out of the truck wearing a faded tank top, holding a gigantic iced coffee, and took one look at my neon-green, toxic waste dump of a pond. He didn't even say hello. He just took a slow sip of his coffee, stared at the bubbling foam, and sighed. "Smells like a bleach factory died in a chlorine fire," Tommy grunted, kicking a piece of limestone coping. "You pissed off the wrong soccer mom, didn't you?" I mean, literally. "Yes," I said, leaning against the brick wall. Brenda over there decided she didn't like the sound of the waterfall, so she nuked Bert and Ernie. Tommy's face darkened. He had hand-picked the filtration system for this pond. He respected aquatic engineering more than he respected most people. "So, what's the play? We lining the bottom with concrete and putting in a bronze statue of you flipping her off?" "Better," I smiled, pulling out a thick manila folder filled with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service printouts. "We are building a safe harbor foster habitat for the critically endangered Jollyville Plateau salamander. It has to meet exact federal specifications. We need Edwards Aquifer limestone, Tommy. We need a commercial-grade water chiller to keep it at exactly 68 degrees year-round. We need reverse osmosis filtration. Mantuham. Zero UV exposure on the breeding caves, and oxygenation levels that would make a hyperbaric chamber jealous. Tommy stared at me for a long, silent moment. I guess he was trying to figure out if I had completely lost my mind. Finally, a slow, terrifying grin spread across his face. "You're baiting a federal trap," he muttered, his voice rumbling with deep approval. "You want her to poison it again." "I am officially inviting the United States government to claim jurisdiction over my backyard," I replied. "If she throws so much as a pebble in there once the salamanders arrive, she is committing a felony under the Endangered Species Act. But I need the habitat built perfectly, or the university biologist won't sign off on the drop-off." "Give me 3 days," Tommy said, cracking his massive knuckles. And a blank check for the chiller unit." For the next 72 hours, my backyard was an absolute war zone, and I honestly loved every single second of it. Tommy brought in a crew of guys who worked with the silent, brutal efficiency of a military unit. They pumped out the toxic green sludge into specialized hazmat barrels, power-washed the liner, and started ripping out the old aesthetic rocks to replace them with hyper-specific, porous limestone shipped directly from a quarry down south. And of course, Brenda couldn't handle it. By noon on the second day, the heavy machinery was buzzing, the tile saws were screaming, and Brenda's head popped over the brick wall like an angry blonde prairie dog. "Excuse me! Excuse me!" she screeched over the noise of a concrete mixer. "What on earth is going on over here? Do you have any idea how loud this is? I have a virtual Pilates class in 10 minutes. Tommy, who was currently shoulder-deep in a trench routing PVC pipes for the new chiller, didn't even look up. He just kept working. I walked over, putting on my absolute best customer service smile. "Hey, Brenda," I yelled over the machinery. "Just doing some landscaping, trying to clean up that nasty algae problem you pointed out." "You don't need a construction crew to clean a puddle," she snapped, her eyes darting around the massive pallets of stone. "This is an eyesore, and it's violating the HOA noise ordinance. I am calling the president of the board right now. And who are these thugs you have working for you?" Tommy slowly pulled himself out of the trench. He stood up to his full 6'4" height. I wiped a smudge of mud off his heavily tattooed bicep and took a slow, deliberate step toward the wall. Brenda visibly shrank back. "Ma'am," Tommy rumbled, his voice so deep you could feel it in your chest. "I am currently calculating the exact structural load of this limestone. If I accidentally drop a pallet of it over this wall, it's going to crush your patio furniture into a fine dust. I'd highly recommend you go do your little stretches inside." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a guppy. She went entirely pale, sputtered something incomprehensible about calling the police, and disappeared behind the wall. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. I mean, playing diplomat when your contractor looks like a final boss in a video game is tough, but it was buying us the time we needed. By the end of day 3, the habitat was flawless. The water was crystal clear, cycling through a massive chiller unit hidden behind a decorative screen, keeping the temperature at a brisk, pristine 68 degrees. We had built intricate underwater cave systems using the limestone, completely shielded from direct sunlight. But the most important piece of the puzzle wasn't the rocks or the water. It was the surveillance. I am a tech guy by trade, so I wasn't going to rely on some cheap, battery-powered doorbell camera. I spent $4,000 on a military-grade 4K night vision camera system. I hollowed out 2 artificial resin rocks and mounted the lenses perfectly flush with the surface. I positioned them directly across the pond, angled upward. They had a perfectly unobstructed, A high-definition view of the exact spot on the brick wall where Brenda had stood with her jug of bleach. I hardwired the cameras directly to an encrypted server rack in my garage, set to record 24/7, with a motion-activated push notification sent straight to my phone. The trap was fully armed. We just needed the bait. The next morning, Dr. Eris Thorne arrived. He was exactly what you would expect a university conservation biologist to look like. A skinny, twitchy guy in his late 30s with a patchy beard, wearing cargo shorts and a faded t-shirt with a picture of a frog on it. He drove a state-issued hybrid SUV and carried two heavily insulated Yeti coolers up my driveway, like they contained human organs. "Water test?" he asked, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Passed with flying colors," I said, as handing him the printouts from the digital water tester. "pH is neutral, no chlorine, 0 heavy metals, temperature holding steady at 68.2. Dr. Thorne walked around the pond, inspecting the limestone caves, checking the flow rate of the chiller. He looked like a home inspector trying to find a reason to fail me. But Tommy had done his job perfectly. Eventually, Thorne let out a breath and nodded. "It's good," he said, pulling a massive stack of paperwork from his backpack. "Honestly, this is better than the holding tanks at the university. All right, let's get the safe harbor agreement signed. By signing this, you acknowledge that this artificial body of water is now legally considered a critical habitat annex for the Eurasea tonkawai. You cannot alter it, drain it, or introduce foreign species without federal approval. Understand?" "Absolutely," I said, practically snatching the pen from his hand. I signed my name in 4 different places. The moment pen hit paper, the legal magic spell was cast. My backyard was no longer just a backyard. It was a federally protected conservation zone. Dr. Thorne opened the coolers. Inside, floating in specialized transport bags, were 12 of the weirdest-looking things I had ever seen. The Jollyville Plateau salamanders were maybe 3 inches long, pale, blind, and looked exactly like translucent, undercooked gummy worms with tiny, ridiculous little legs and frilly gills poking out of their necks. They were entirely defenseless. I loved them immediately. We acclimated the bags, and then, one by one, Dr. Thorne released them into the water. They fluttered down into the limestone caves, disappearing into the dark, cool crevices. "They're settled," Thorne said, packing up his coolers. "I'll be back in a month to check on their breeding progress. Keep the water clean." "Oh," I said, a dark smile playing on my lips. "I will protect them with my life." Once Thorne drove away, it was time to set the hook. Brenda hadn't poked her head over the wall since Tommy threatened her with a pallet of rocks, but I knew she was watching. I knew she was seething. I needed to force her hand. I needed her to hate this new pond even more than she hated the old one. So, I threw a party. I called up about 20 of my loudest, most obnoxious friends. I bought 3 kegs of cheap beer, fired up the smoker, and set up a pair of massive Bluetooth speakers right next to the brick wall. I cranked up a playlist consisting entirely of mid-2000s pop-punk and heavy bass, EDM. While we laughed, we yelled, we played cornhole, and every time I walked near the wall, I made sure to loudly exclaim to my friends, "Man, I just love the new pond. I'm so glad I spent $15,000 on it. The trickling sound is just so peaceful, don't you think?" I was poking the bear with a very short, very sharp stick. Around 8 p.m., right on schedule, the cops showed up for a noise complaint. It wasn't Officer Miller this time, just a rookie who looked bored. I immediately turned the music down, apologized profusely, and handed him a plate of brisket. He told me to keep it quiet, and left. I looked at the brick wall and raised my plastic cup in a silent toast. "Your move, Brenda?" By midnight, the party was over. My friends had taken their Ubers home. The backyard was cleaned up, and the house was completely dark. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my phone resting heavily on my chest. I couldn't sleep. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in my ears. 1 o'clock passed. Then 1:30. I was starting to think she wasn't going to take the bait. I was starting to think maybe the party had just intimidated her into staying inside. Then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., my phone screen violently lit up the dark bedroom. A high-pitched chime echoed through the quiet house. I snatched the phone and looked at the lock screen. Alert! Motion detected at camera 1, north wall. I swiped the notification, bringing up the live 4K feed. And there she was. Illuminated in crisp, ghostly green night vision, Brenda was standing on a stepladder on her side of the wall. She was wearing a leopard print nightgown and a hairnet, and in her hands, resting heavily on the brick coping, was a massive 2-gallon jug of concentrated splashless bleach. She paused, looking around the dark yard, completely oblivious to the artificial rock staring directly at her face. Then, with a heave, she unscrewed the cap. I threw off the bedsheets. It was time to go to war. I literally did not even pause to put on shoes. I mean, when you have 12 critically endangered, federally protected gummy worm amphibians relying on you for survival, fashion goes out the window. I sprinted through the dark house in nothing but my plaid boxers and a faded t-shirt, my bare feet slapping furiously against the hardwood floors. I hit the back patio door so hard it bounced off the stopper, the humid Texas night air slamming into me like a physical wall. From across the yard, I heard the distinct, heavy glug, glug, glug of viscous liquid hitting water. Hey! I bellowed, my voice cracking the absolute silence of the 2 a.m. cul-de-sac. I saw the flashlight beam from Brenda's side of the wall jerk wildly. There was a sharp gasp, the sound of plastic scraping against brick, and a heavy thud as she presumably fell off her little stepladder. The jug hit the ground on her side of the wall with a hollow bounce. I didn't care about her. I didn't care if she had broken an ankle. I only cared about the water. I scrambled to the edge of the limestone. The smell hit me instantly. It was blindingly strong, the sharp, unmistakable, burning chemical stench of concentrated industrial bleach. It was already blooming in the pristine, 68-degree water, a cloudy, venomous plume expanding directly above the primary breeding cave. Honestly, I was panicking, but Dr. Thorne had planned for emergencies. He had left me with 3 emergency quarantine tubs, pre-filled with correctly balanced reverse osmosis water, sitting on standby in the garage. I ran fast enough to pull a hamstring, grabbed the heavy plastic tubs, and hauled them to the water's edge along with a specialized, soft mesh aquatic net. I dropped to my knees, plunging my arms into the freezing water. The bleach stung the micro-cuts on my hands immediately. I didn't care. I swept the net through the dark crevices of the limestone. Finding blind, translucent 3-inch salamanders in the dark while a toxic chemical cloud is expanding is exactly as stressful as it sounds. Come on, you little weirdos, I muttered, my teeth actually chattering from the adrenaline and the cold water. One by one, I scooped them up. They were frantically swimming in erratic, but confused circles. I transferred them into the quarantine tubs. 1, 2, 3, 5, 9. I was up to my shoulders in the water now, my t-shirt completely soaked, sweeping the very bottom of the chiller intake. 10, 11. Where was the last one? I grabbed a waterproof flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam through the cloudy, bleach-stained water. There, huddled in the farthest corner, dangerously close to the heaviest concentration of the chemical, was number 12. I lunged, practically diving half my body into the pond, and scooped it up in the soft mesh. I dropped it into the final tub and slammed the lids shut. I sat back on the wet grass, my chest heaving, staring at the tubs. All 12 were accounted for. They were safe. I looked up at the brick wall. The smell of bleach was overpowering now, and the chiller system was circulating the poison through the entire multi-thousand-dollar setup. The habitat was completely destroyed. But as I sat there, shivering in my soaking wet boxers, a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened the security app and pulled up the recorded footage. It was, honestly, the most beautiful piece of cinematography I had ever seen. The 4K night vision had captured everything in terrifying, flawless detail. Brenda's face, scowling in the dark, the leopard print nightgown, the hairnet, the massive jug of bleach, the clear, undeniable arc of the toxic liquid leaving the spout and splashing directly into the federally protected water. I even had audio. You could hear her mutter, "Let's see how much noise this makes," right before she poured it. Oh, I didn't call Officer Miller. I didn't call the West Lake Hills Police Department. Local cops deal with local problems. I walked inside, dried off, put on a pot of incredibly strong coffee, and opened my laptop. I went straight to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service website and found the 24-hour emergency tip line for the Office of Law Enforcement. I dialed the number. It rang twice. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Office of Law Enforcement, Dispatcher Higgins. A crisp, wide-awake voice answered. "Hi, yes," I said, leaning forward on my kitchen counter. "I need to report an intentional, malicious take of a critically endangered species, caught on high-definition video." There was a pause. The typing on the other end stopped. "Sir, can you specify the species and the location?" "The Eurysea tonkawai. I'm the Jollyville Plateau salamander," I replied, reading the scientific name off my notes just to sound as official as possible. "I am a registered safe harbor foster habitat in Travis County, Texas. My neighbor just dumped 2 gallons of concentrated bleach directly into the primary breeding pool. I have the entire incident on 4K camera." "One moment, sir," Higgins said. Her tone had shifted from polite dispatcher to absolute zero-tolerance federal employee. While I waited on hold, I drafted a massive email. I attached the 4K video file, the audio clips, a copy of my signed safe harbor agreement, and the water quality reports from Dr. Thorne. But I didn't just send it to the USFWS. I copied the regional director of the Environmental Protection Agency. Because, as my research had shown, my pond was technically designed to overflow into the local storm drains during heavy rain, which fed directly into the Colorado River watershed. By pouring industrial bleach into that specific pond, Brenda had just violated the Clean Water Act, 33 U.S.C. Section 1311, for illegal, unlicensed dumping of a toxic pollutant into a navigable waterway system. The line clicked back over. A deep, gravelly voice spoke. "This is Special Agent Vance. You have footage of an intentional poisoning of a safe harbor site?" "Yes, Agent Vance," I said. "And honestly, I need someone out here. The habitat is compromised. The specimens are currently in emergency quarantine tubs, but I don't know how much stress they can take." "Send the footage to the email I'm about to give you," Vance commanded. What he sounded like a man who had dedicated his entire life to protecting small, defenseless animals, and who absolutely despised people who messed with them. "Do not engage with the neighbor. Do not alter the scene. We are initiating a federal investigation." I guess the federal government doesn't mess around when it comes to their gummy worms. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I didn't drain the pond. I let the bleach sit there, stinking up the entire property line. I kept the salamanders safely inside my house, running a makeshift aeration system for the tubs. Brenda, meanwhile, was acting like nothing had happened. On Sunday afternoon, she had the absolute audacity to host a garden party on her patio. I could hear clinking glasses and the obnoxious, braying laughter of her friends. Or she was probably bragging about how she had finally solved the noise problem next door. I literally just sat in my garage, drinking a beer, watching the 4K footage on a loop, and waiting. Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. The air was already thick and humid. I was standing in my kitchen, brewing my morning espresso, when the rumble started. It wasn't the rattling diesel cough of Tommy's work truck. It was a heavy, synchronized, terrifying rumble. I walked to my front window and peeked through the blinds. A convoy had arrived in the cul-de-sac. 2 completely blacked-out Chevy Tahoes with government plates parked aggressively across Brenda's driveway, blocking her in completely. Right behind them, a bright green, heavy-duty pickup truck with the Texas Parks and Wildlife emblem emblazoned on the side hopped the curb. And pulling up the rear, yet looking incredibly small and entirely out of his depth, was Officer Miller in his local PD cruiser. I grabbed my coffee mug and walked out onto my front porch. This was exactly what I had paid Tommy $15,000 for. This was sovereign justice. 4 individuals stepped out of the Tahoes. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing olive green tactical vests with Federal Agent USFWS printed in massive yellow letters across the back. They had sidearms. They had clipboards. They moved with the terrifying coordinated purpose of a SWAT team about to raid a cartel compound. Special Agent Vance, I assumed it was him based on the sheer aura of authority he projected, walked up to Brenda's massive, solid oak front door and didn't knock. He pounded on it with a heavy metal flashlight. It sounded like a battering ram. "Federal agents! Open the door!" Vance's voice echoed off the pristine McMansions of Westlake Hills. A few porch lights flicked on down the street. Neighbors were peeking out of their windows. It took about 45 seconds for the door to open. Brenda stood there, wearing a silk, floral print robe, holding a tiny, yapping Pomeranian. Her face went from sleepy annoyance to absolute, blood-draining horror in a fraction of a second. What is the meaning of this?" she stammered, clutching the dog to her chest. "Do you know what time it is? I am the vice president of the HOA." "Brenda Higgins?" Special Agent Vance asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He didn't wait for her to answer. He held up a thick stack of papers. "I have a federal warrant for the search of these premises, and a warrant for your arrest under Title 16 of the United States Code, Section 1538, for the illegal take of a federally protected endangered species, and Title 33, Section 1311, for violation of the Clean Water Act." "Endangered species?" Brenda screeched, her voice cracking. "Clean Water Act? I don't even hunt. What are you talking about?" Vance just stared at her. "Ma'am, step aside. We are executing the warrant." 2 agents pushed past her into the house. Brenda started hyperventilating. She looked wildly out into the street and spotted Officer Miller, who was leaning against his cruiser, holding a cup of gas station coffee, looking completely bewildered. "Officer!" Brenda yelled, pointing frantically. "Officer Miller, arrest these men! They are trespassing! They are harassing me!" Miller took a slow sip of his coffee. But he looked at the heavily armed federal agents, then looked at Brenda, and then looked across the yard at me, standing on my porch in my bathrobe, holding my espresso mug. I gave him a very small, very polite nod. Miller sighed, shook his head, and called back to Brenda. "It's a federal matter, Brenda. My hands are tied. Should have just let the man keep his fish. I mean, I literally could not have scripted it better." 10 minutes later, the agents emerged from Brenda's side gate. One of them was carrying 2 empty, commercial-grade jugs of industrial algae destroyer in a massive, clear plastic evidence bag. They had found the murder weapons right there in her recycling bin. And then came the finale. Brenda was escorted out of her front door. She wasn't holding the Pomeranian anymore. Her hands were secured behind her back in heavy, metal handcuffs. She was sobbing, mascara running down her face, still wearing the floral silk robe. "This is a mistake!" she wailed, as an agent guided her toward the back of a Tahoe. "It was just a stupid puddle. It was just algae. You can't do this to me. I drive a Mercedes." Vance turned to her before putting her in the vehicle. "Ma'am, you intentionally poisoned a safe harbor critical habitat containing 12 Eurysea tonkawae. You are facing up to $50,000 in fines and a year in federal prison per violation. There were 12 specimens. You do the math." He pushed her head down, shoved her into the back seat, and slammed the heavy door shut. The metallic thud echoed perfectly through the quiet morning air. Vance walked over to my property line. I met him at the edge of the grass. "You the homeowner?" he asked. I am," I smiled. "Dr. Thorne is on his way to collect the specimens and supervise the decontamination of the habitat," Vance said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You built a hell of a trap, kid." "I just built a pond, Agent Vance," I replied innocently. "I can't control what my neighbors throw into it." Vance let out a single, sharp exhale that might have been a laugh. "Right. Keep the water clean." He turned, walked back to his Tahoe, and the entire federal convoy rolled out of the cul-de-sac, taking the neighborhood terror with them. Honestly, the aftermath was even sweeter than the raid. Brenda didn't go to federal prison. First-time offenders with expensive lawyers usually don't. But the EPA and the USFWS absolutely destroyed her financially. Between the federal fines, the mandatory environmental cleanup fees, and her astronomical legal defense costs, she was completely bankrupted. 3 months later, a for sale sign popped up on her manicured lawn. The bank foreclosed on the house. As for the pond, Tommy came back, drained the toxic water, scrubbed the limestone, and flushed the chiller system. Dr. Thorne brought the gummy worms back a week later. They are currently thriving, completely oblivious to the fact that they single-handedly took down a neighborhood tyrant. So remember, folks, before you mess with a man's pond, you better make sure you aren't messing with the federal government. Stay sovereign, stay just, and I'll see you in the next one.